In this brief video, I'm going to break down how to create a course timer in Articulate Storyline 360, including an automatic timeout feature, which will pause the timer if the learner spends more than a given amount of time on any particular slide. And that will help you to ensure your time data is accurate, even if a learner gets up and leaves their computer for an extended period of time. Okay, to create this timer, first you have to navigate to the slide master view. And you can see that the timer involves 3 layers that I've called timer, timeout, and timeout notification. The timer layer is set for 1 second. The timeout layer should be set for the amount of time you would like before the timer is paused. And the timeout notification layer is the layer that a learner will see when the timer has been paused, and they'll have to take an action in order to close this layer and unpause the timer. There are multiple triggers on each layer that allow this timer to work. On the base layer, there are 2 triggers. The first trigger is to show the layer timer when the timeline starts, and the second trigger is to show the layer timeout when the timeline starts. On the timer layer, there are 3 triggers. The first trigger is to add a value of 1 to a variable called seconds when the timeline ends on this layer, which is after 1 second. The second trigger is to hide this layer when the timeline ends on this layer. And the third trigger is to show this layer when the timeline ends on this layer. And this essentially creates a loop whereby the timeline on this layer starts over and over and over again every second, each time adding a value of 1 to the variable second. There are also 3 triggers on the timeout layer. The first trigger is to hide the layer timer when the timeline ends on this timeout layer. The second trigger is to show the layer timeout notification when the timeline ends on this timeout layer. And the third trigger is to hide this layer when the timeline ends on this layer. Finally, on the timeout notification layer, there are also 3 triggers. The first trigger is to show the layer timer when the user clicks this button or whatever action you've specified for the learner to take. The second trigger is to show the layer timeout when the user clicks this button or takes an action. And the third trigger is to hide this layer when the user clicks the button or takes an action. And those are the only triggers that are required for this timer to work. The only other thing you need to worry about is making sure that for each layer you go into properties and make sure this hide other slide layers is unchecked, which means each of the slide layers, timer, timeout, and timeout notification can be displayed at the same time, which is required for this timer to work. Okay, so if we close the master view, we can see if this works. So I have 2 slides in my project. We're on the first slide now. You can see my timer is going up, and I'll expect it to pause after 10 seconds. Okay, so it's paused. I've been inactive for X minutes, in this case 10 seconds. I'll click here to continue. You can see that the timer continues to increase. It automatically unpaused when I clicked the button, and I'll expect it to pause again after 20 seconds. Okay, unpause again, and I can navigate to the next slide here, slide 2. So you see the timer picks up where it left off at around 22 seconds, so I would expect it to pause around 32 seconds. And there you go. And that is how you create a timer in Articulate Storyline 360 with an automatic timeout feature.